All right, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about the ancient Near East. The ancient Near East is broken up into two sections. The first is kind of the Bronze Age, which is the foundation of these cultures in Mesopotamia. These are the cultures of Sumer, Akkad, the old Babylonian Empire, Mari, etc. And then later, after we've talked about Egypt and the Bronze Age Aegean, we'll come back to the ancient Near East because it has a massive resurgence during the Iron Age and the first true empires. The Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians, the Persians are all going to be during the Iron Age, which is much later. So let's just orient you on what part of the world we're talking about. Again, we're talking about the part of the world that we call the Middle East, but usually in anthropological and archaeological circles is called the Near East, because it is the part of the East that is nearest to Europe. Again, that's a rather ethnocentric worldview, but that's the reality of it. We're talking about the countries of Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria through here also, but predominantly it's going to be this chunk here, which is Iraq. So anciently, these areas were called, at least by the Greeks, Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers. And the two rivers are, of course, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which flow down to the Persian Gulf here. And then we also have this section known as the Levant. And the Levant is a massive crossroads. It, can be reached from any direction, even though this is pretty abject desert through here. This is the Arabian Desert. This section is what we call the Fertile Crescent, because it has a vaguely crescent shape here. Here's a kind of a view giving you a sense of it. Here's Mesopotamia right there, and here is the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent more or less includes Mesopotamia, parts of Syria, southern Turkey, and then the Levant coast as you go down to Egypt. And the reason this was fertile is because even though most of this is desert, it has perennial water sources. So the Tigris and Euphrates draw on all of these mountains in Turkey and Iran, and they come down into the Persian Gulf, which means even if you have no rain, if you have rivers, you can irrigate. And everybody in the world everyone who lives in Utah should understand the importance of irrigation. Maybe not so much anymore. I mean, now our major industries are tourism, for criminy sake. But when you were a farmer back in the pioneer period, there wouldn't have been any farming in Utah had it not been for irrigation. Now, in the Levant, it's a little different because you have storm clouds that come in over the Mediterranean. They hit the low-lying hills here of the Judea Highlands up to Mount Hermon, and those mountains shed water back to the coast, to the plain of Sharon and Gaza, etc. So it's actually a lot more green than you would expect. So that's the layout, and it makes sense that the first, cities would be here. Jericho, the city we've already talked about, is right there, and the first probably true city, Uruk, or Erech or Warka, depending on how you want to say it, is right there. So we enter into the Bronze Age. Somewhere around 4000 BCE, we developed the ability to make bronze. Bronze, of course, is the mixture between copper and tin. Copper is pretty useful as a tool, but it's not terribly hard. But you mix it with a small amount of tin, just 5 to 10% tin, and suddenly you have a very, very versatile material that can cut and is very hard and really easy to cast and produce as long as you can get to the materials. So this causes another technological revolution. That's why we call this the Bronze Age, and not surprisingly, we break this into the Early Bronze Age, the Middle Bronze Age, and the Late Bronze Age. After we get about, into the second millennium BC, we start moving into the Late Bronze Age, but we'll save that for another time. And here's where the oldest true civilization on Earth is founded, a civilization known as Sumer, or Sumeria. And Sumer has a very long history. This is an ethnic group of people we call Sumerians and Elamites, and they are the only game in town for thousands of years. It's just mind-boggling how old the Sumerian civilization is. But because Mesopotamia is a big open valley and can be raided from anywhere, We have a group known as the Akkadians, who come from a little further up north, the Mesopotamian valley, and they conquer the Sumerians. The Sumerians reassert themselves, and we have a period we call the Neo-Sumerians, the New Sumerians, and then they're conquered by a group a little further up the valley known as the Old Babylonians. And then there's another group that's actually not in Mesopotamia, that's actually centered in the highlands of Anatolia and Turkey, and that is Hatti, or Hattusha, or the Hittites. And they come along and they pretty much conquer the Old Babylonians. And that'll get you through the early period, but it's important to know that Uruk, the first city, is found under the Sumerians. The invention of writing, the establishment of civilization itself, is really the product of Sumer. And so all of those ideas, all of these Eastern Semitic ideas of the rule of law, writing, the first astronomical observations and natural law, all of that comes from Sumer. So that's where it originates ultimately before it passes to the Western Semitic populations like the Phoenicians, and that's where the Greeks basically steal a lot of their ideas from. So when we look at these first colonies of human civilization, these first establishments, they're not a true nation state in the sense that we think of it. Each city is its own independent nation state. Each city is a kind of little kingdom unto itself. And they're all founded on some very important principles. The first is this idea of social hierarchy, particularly divine kingship, religious centers, particularly temples, and the last is trade and writing. Now, I do want to take a pause here and talk about civilization and what we mean by civilization. You're going to hear me say that this group is civilized and this group is uncivilized, and I don't want there to be any confusion about what I mean. Civilization is an anthropological term, at least it is the way I'm using it. It comes from the Latin, and it literally just means people who live in cities. And it's literally urban living. That means that you have some kind of state rule, hierarchy, taxes, rule of law. There's a division of labor and trade. There's centralized worship with temples and cults of worship. Oh, another thing I should define. When I say cult, people usually think I mean, like a cult or bizarre kind of religious. In anthropological terms, a cult is any system of worship. So I practice a cult. I know lots of people think Mormons are cults, but so we're Catholics, so we're Protestants. Any system of worship where you have an organized system of worship is a cult of worship. And it doesn't mean the negative thing. People have taken the word in the modern era to mean something else. So just like civilization, we've taken that word to mean something else. And it's important to know that uncivilized versus civilized, it just means, how do you live? Do you live in cities? Do you live in cities with this complex social stratification? Or do you live, say, in a tent, in a semi-nomadic relationship? Now, it's important to know that anciently, people who lived in cities looked at people who lived in rural environments as, barbarians and savages. You still get a little bit of that, but that's really prejudicial. And frankly, the truth is that many nomadic and semi-nomadic cultures had very sophisticated cultures and also had higher moral standards than people living in cities. So that's all I mean when I mean a civilization, is do they live in cities or not? Do they have this complicated, structured, organized form of living? So right at the core of this is this concept of kingship. And kingship is divinely derived in the ancient world. And it makes sense. So if you have a king and you're not related to him, how do you know you can trust him? Well, you can trust him because he is foreordained by the gods. And it's important to know that there's no such thing as separation between church and state in the ancient world. The king is usually the priest of the gods, and oftentimes he's regarded as a descendant of the gods. This might be a representation of Gilgamesh here on the right, and Gilgamesh actually traces his lineage back to the gods. He's a descendant of the gods themselves. And so you actually have this strange kind of nebulous area. Sometimes the king asserts that he has this divine mandate from the gods, and sometimes he asserts he is a god himself. And so it's really hard to tell, is this, is a king a divine king? Is he a literal god king, or is he just claiming that the gods mandate his existence? And it changes from time to time. And again, religion is this glue that holds people together. It's what allows people to work and cooperate together. So you're also going to see temples with organized religious offices and organized cult ritual, systems of worship and sacrifice. And again, this is community ritual. A lot of it is built around personal devotion. People did have ideas of personal salvation even back then. But the biggest thing is that it's more of a community thing. Again, the idea of private religion, of a person in their home, in a private religion, is not as important in the ancient world as this community binder, this cultural binder that holds you together. Here's a wonderful example. This is a votive plaque dedicated to the goddess Inanna. Goddess Inanna is the goddess. She's also analogous to the goddess Ishtar, and she is the goddess of war and love and fertility and a lot of other things. And you can tell she's a goddess because she's standing on the backs of lions. She's flanked by owls. These are creatures of the night. She has wings. She holds these knots in her hand, which represent her authority. And then she has this tiered crown or tiara made out of bull's horns. And she's associated with Venus, with the planet Venus, the morning and evening star, and is a very important person in that worldview. She here is, this is a devotional plaque. So this was a mass-produced plaque that you could go and buy, and so this would be a votive. And what that means is you would purchase this, take it to the temple, and then this would represent you to the goddess and would probably be interred or buried in the temple. And the last thing that's very important is trade. And trade is important because it gives us probably one of the greatest inventions of mankind. That is the invention of writing. So you have a bunch of these small city-states. They're all gathered together. And just like it makes sense for one person to specialize in a trade, it made sense for cities to specialize. Some cities were better at raising animals. Some cities were better at making cloth. And so, again, laws of comparative advantage. If someone is better at weaving cloth, it makes no sense to make him farm. We'll put him on cloth full time, and he can be more productive that way. And if someone is a better, say, tanner of leather, we'll put him on that job. There's no sense in teaching him to learn cloth. We all do better if we specialize. And then rather than all of us have to do everything, we just specialize in the thing we're good at, and then we trade. So, and you trade, and most of this was done under a barter system. So you would trade cloth for leather, or, wheat for, cloth or whatever you had. So these towns started trading with each other, and the problem is when you trade with another town, if you're a merchant of any size, you don't have the time to go to every single town and trade yourself. So I want you to imagine this scenario. You're a master merchant. You have a servant or a slave, most likely. You send him to the next town over and you say, hey, I have 4 bolts of cloth. I want you to come back with 20 beakers of beer. And I'm not just being funny. Beer was a major trade item in the ancient world because beer was like bread. It had the same amount of calories, was like liquid bread, and it also gave you this wonderful buzz, and it didn't go bad like bread. So it was a huge trade item. It was a major food staple as well. So you're going to go trade some 4 bolts of cloth for 20 beakers of beer. And so you send your slave off, and he goes and he trades, and he comes back with 19 beakers of beer. And you're like, what? Didn't I tell you don't settle for anything less than 20 beakers of beer? And he said, well, the guy was really tough and he just wouldn't bend, so this is the best I could do. Now you have a problem. Did he really only come back with 19 beakers of beer? Or did he and his fellow servants stop in the middle of the desert, crack open a beaker of beer and have their own private kegger and then just lied to you about it? So you don't know. And so how do you know if what you traded for is what you got? And how do you know if people aren't stealing from you? Well, they came up with this really ingenious system. And it's a system of tokens and seals. So these things that you see down here are tokens. And each one of these tokens represents a specific trade item. Okay? And they would seal this up into a clay ball, and then the clay ball would have a seal pushed across the surfaces of it. We have these cylinder seals that have patterns. And so here's a cylinder, and you would roll it across the clay, and it gives this impression. And so this would, be like your signature, your seal on this. And it would be very hard to mimic this. So what you do is, you send him out. There's 4 bolts of cloth. Go trade for 20 beakers of beer. And he comes back with 19 beakers of beer, and he says, well, we couldn't get him to trade for any, more than that. And you say, okay, fine. Did he hand you a ball when we did this? And they said, yeah. And you take the ball, and you crack open the ball, and you count the tokens inside. And you go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 19, 20. I'm going to get myself a new slave. And that slave's life is, he's done. And so this was a way of making sure that the goods promised at one location were the goods delivered at the next location. And that's how they did it. And so they had these little tokens. Well, after a while, people said, if you start trading more than, a few dozen things, it's impossible to, you'd have to have a beach ball-sized clay ball to hold all the tokens for everything you're trading. And so people said, just screw it. We'll just write it on clay tablets. And so they took clay tablets, and they would write onto those clay tablets, rather than do a token, they would draw an image of the thing they were doing. And so here you can see how this works, that they were actually drawing a stalk of barley, and then after a while, people just started to develop a shorthand for that. And you can see how things get simpler, that you start with a kind of drawing of a foot, but they had this wedge-shaped tool called a stylus right here, and you would press that into the clay, and you would press these cone-shaped wedges into the clay. And it was a way of really just simplifying the drawing. Until eventually, instead of little pictograms of the things you were trading, you had little, abstract symbols. I mean, you can see how that kind of looks like a barley, plant there. But by the time you get down here, it doesn't look like a barley plant anymore. Same thing with, a foot. It looks like a foot when you start, but by the time it just turns into an abstract symbol. And after a while, they realized that you could do more with these symbols than just do record keeping. You could actually write down stories. You could write down events and history. But it all started because of trade. And it's actually quite hilarious. When you look at the first tablets, they're all receipts for things like taxes or tribute or commercial engagements. The most boring things in the world. The oldest tablets in the world are all boring things. Here's probably one of the oldest tablets in the world. This is the Kish tablet. And you can see those little pictograms on it. And this is just a receipt. This is just a tally. This one's a little later, and you can see how this one has changed. And this one is actually a tax receipt. Death and taxes. I tell you can't get away from this stuff. And so what you're looking at here are little simplified cuneiform symbols. That's what this writing system is called, cuneiform. And you can see that you have a cuneiform symbol that represents the thing that's, being given as a tax to the temple. And then you have circles, and the circles represent 5, and then you have hash marks, which represent, individual numbers. So you can tell that over here you have 5, 10, 11. Oh, that's the head of this thing. I'm sorry. So here you have 5, 10, and then here's the other one. Here's 11. So you can tell individual tallies. You can actually count up the numbers of things. And if you look at these, you can actually tell what some of these are supposed to be. This thing here is actually an ingot of copper. That's the shape of an ingot of copper. So that's 1 ingot of copper. But this thing right here is an animal. See, it's got 4 legs and a head. That thing I thought was a hash mark is actually its head. And here's another animal. So this is a sheep or a goat or a cow or something. And this is how many you're giving. And there's all the tallies. Okay, so initially this stuff was really boring. You could record records, that you owed this much or you gave this much, etc. But after a while, people realized that you could do far more. You could record histories. You could record who was king when. You could write down your mythology, your belief systems, etc. Now, these clay tablets were just recycled. They would just, write on them, let them dry out, and then when they needed to recycle them, they'd throw them into a bucket of water and let it turn back into soft clay and then reuse it. But there was a library in Ebla, and in the library in Ebla, the library caught fire. And so the fire actually fired these tablets. So it was a disaster for the people at the time, but it was a miracle for us because it preserved some records, including some of the oldest records we have, like the story of Gilgamesh. And the story of Gilgamesh, if you have never read it, you really ought to go read it. It's an amazing story because it shows that the people then had many of the same ideas and beliefs that we had. The story of Gilgamesh, long story short, is a story of a king. He goes mad. The gods send him this wild man. The two of them, pair up and they have a huge fight. And at the end of it, they're best buds. And so that's Gilgamesh and Enkidu. And they go out and they have many great adventures together. But eventually they slay the bull of heaven, which is the bull that takes the sun across the sky. And the gods say, that's it. It's too much. And so they slay Enkidu as punishment. And so Gilgamesh is all alone. And so he goes on this quest for the meaning of life. And he goes to find out what the meaning of life is. He has all these adventures. Eventually he winds up at the home of Utnapishtim, I think is the name. And Utnapishtim is a guy who, in the ancient times, saved the world from a flood by putting 2 of every animal into a gigantic wooden boat. Sound familiar? It should. It's essentially the same story as Noah. And Utnapishtim tells him that, there's this weed at the bottom of the ocean, that if he retrieves it, he'll have eternal life. And Gilgamesh goes to recover it, but a serpent snatches it at the last moment. And so he cannot find eternal life. So he decides, you know what? I've been kind of a putz. I should go back to my people in my city and rebuild the walls of the city. I should give them laws, and I should take care of them and make sure that they have, a just life. And so it's a kind of discussion about what is meaningful in life, about how death is inevitable, about how, life is fleeting, and you need to concentrate on the important things. But it's really important to us in art history and in history because it gives us a sense of understanding these cultures. We can look at things like this fragment of the Stele of Naram-Sin, and we can interpret who this person is, this god here, who sits, because of the things that he actually holds on to. We can interpret his iconography and get a sense of it. And let's just remember, we were talking in the Neolithic period about this character here, this mother goddess. We don't know her name. We have no idea who she is or exactly which deity she's supposed to represent. But we know that this is Inanna, and that Inanna is associated with Venus. She's associated with love and fertility, and also death and war. Kind of strange how those go together. And we can identify her accoutrements, and we know who we are. That's the difference between having these writings and not having these writings. It makes it very, very important to have these things. So this is the boundary between the historical period and prehistory. Before prehistory, there's no writings. We're just intuiting based on what we can see in their imagery. But after this, we can look at their writings and we can get a better sense. Now, it's not perfect because I hate to break this to you, but historians lie. And they've been lying since time immemorial. And they tend to make their kings and gods look great, and the kings and gods of foreigners look bad. And so you'll see those kind of things. But it at least gives, so we have to do a lot of this with a grain of salt, but it at least gives us a sense of knowing who these people are and what they believed. And we can apply it to the art and have a much greater understanding because of it. So going back to our map, let's talk about some of the specific works of art that are happening. Sumer is the lower end of Mesopotamia. So this is upper Mesopotamia up here. But Sumer is down here in the lower end. And this is, just a very fertile area. Again, not much rain, but because you have the two rivers come through there that empty into the Persian Gulf, you have lots of cities. And here are the cities. Mostly we're on the southern end here, but all of these are going to be Sumerian or Elamite cities. But each city would be an independent nation with its own wall and its own kingdom and its own ruler. So Sumer and Uruk are the first we're going to be looking at. Uruk is sometimes called Erech or Warka. We're not exactly sure of the pronunciation, but it's down here in this region here. It has a very long history. You have to realize this city is several thousand years old. We're only going to be looking at the earliest part of it right at the moment. We'll get to the later parts in a bit. But it's a city built on some very low hills, but most of what you're seeing here is not actually geology. It's actually built up out of mud brick. There isn't a lot of rock in the lower Mesopotamian valley, and so the only thing they had to do was build in mud brick. And this was probably the first city, somewhere around 4800 BCE is when it was founded. And it's a major religious center and a major center of trade. The people living here are what we would call Elamite or Sumerian. There's a couple of different languages, a couple different ethnicities. But it's a loose confederation of city-states. That is, each city-state is autonomous and independent, but they come together to trade, or they come together for religious services, or they sometimes come together just, to fight off invaders. And it is developed in this period where they're transitioning from those pictograms into full-on writing. By the time we hit 3300 BC, we have writing. At the 4800 period, they're just starting to work on it. It's a shame that for being one of the greatest civilizations in human history, there's not much left to look at of Sumer. Again, they were limited in their materials. And if you go to Egypt, there's lots of really beautiful stuff to look at because Egypt had stone, and they built out of stone. But there's simply no useful stone in this area, and a lot of stone and wood had to be imported into the area. So what they were building out of was brick, and mostly mud brick. So if you go there today, it just looks like a bunch of mud hills, but these are actually structures, huge piles and mountains of mud brick. And what we're looking at now is the temple to Anu, sometimes called the White Temple. Anu is the chief creator god of the Sumerian world. He is the god that starts all of creation up. And he starts creation by going to the waters. In the Sumerian myth, there is nothing but chaos, and chaos is personified as waters. And Anu, the creator god, reaches down into the waters and he pulls up the first mound of earth. And this creates the first mountain, and he stands on the cosmic mountain at the center of creation, and from there all creation goes forth. And if you live in this part of the world, that makes sense because a lot of this is marshland. And so drawing earth up out of the marshes, etc. It's right there where the fresh waters mix with the sea waters of the Persian Gulf. And so there are fresh waters and gods of fresh waters and gods of salt waters, and the order of making things. And he is the progenitor of all of the other gods, with the exception of maybe Tiamat. Tiamat is a kind of monstrous dragon female figure that represents chaos and represents the waters of the sea. But he comes along and he gives birth to Enlil and Inanna and all the various different deities who become deities of the sky and the sun, the moon, the stars, and make order to the universe. So there is this myth that God lives on a mountain, but if you are in lower Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq, there ain't no mountains. As you can tell, it is an extraordinarily flat place, and it's just mud plains. So if you need a mountain for your god to live on, you have to make it, and that's what they did. They made this mountain right here. So here you can see it's a elevated platform of mud brick. And so the idea is this represents the cosmological mountain. The other thing is that it elevates the god above the mundane plane, that we live on the mundane plane, but this elevates the god to a higher plane. It's a common belief in a lot of cultures that gods live on mountains or gods live in the sky. And so you have to elevate him to get him up. And then he has his temple. And the temple has a single major chamber down the center for the residence of the god. But it also has several side temples. And these are places where votives would be buried and other items would be interred in the temple so that they could be in the presence of the god. The walls are decorated with fired mosaic cones. These are cones that are driven into the surface of the wall to make a kind of decorated mosaic. And you can see they did colored patterns here. Some of these are quite large. Here you can see some of the cones lying on the ground, and here they are pushed into the mud brick wall. But these ended up being very elaborate, creating all kinds of interesting patterns. We find very little sculpture from this time period, unfortunately. Again, remember, they don't have a lot of wood, and they don't have a lot of stone. So even something like this that's made out of limestone would have to be imported from another country. This is the Lady of Uruk, possibly is Inanna, we don't know. Notice that she has a place for eyebrows. She has this fabulous unibrow. And notice that her eyes are missing, and she has this slot in her head. So there probably was a headdress or inlay, possibly metal, or possibly in faience or glass. And we guess this is Inanna. When we look at the statue, you can see that it's a blend of abstraction and naturalism. She has this wonderful Frida Kahlo kind of eyebrow that was probably inlaid in something else, another material. But when we look to the mouth, she has this really tight-lipped mouth, which is a very nice soft roundness to her face. So there's quite a bit of naturalism here, but the eyes are very large and expressive. Presumably this would have been attached either to a wooden statue or a statue made out of stucco or plaster, which was stuff that they did have available. We also find objects like this. This is the Uruk Vase. And the Uruk Vase is a funerary vase. That is a vase given to someone on their death and buried with them. And it shows a procession of ritual libations or offerings. And it seems to show a mixture of gods and mortals. And it employs this thing we call the hierarchical scale. And the hierarchical scale is pretty simple. It's just that more important people are larger than less important people. And there also is a kind of hierarchy of order that in the lower registers we have less important subjects. As we go up to the higher registers we get more important subjects. And it's almost certainly a ritual object. It was probably meant to hold wine or oil or maybe blood, we don't know, as an offering that would have been poured out to the dead. It's really kind of an amazing object, and when you unwrap it, like they do in this drawing, so here you can see how this is unwrapped at the top. We have a series of representations. So at the very bottom we have plants, and then we have animals, rams and sheep, which are sacrificial animals. Then we have people who are undressed, which means that they're probably attendants to the temple. They're just wearing little loincloths or nothing at all, and they're carrying baskets of food or bowls of libations. And all of this attention seems to be focused on a couple of important people here and probably here. All of these animals are being arrayed and being given in sacrifice to this person so that they have sustenance into the afterlife. So, and when we look at these people, they are dressed in kilts, and you can see that there's a person here helping this person to be dressed, which is kind of an investiture ceremony. So this is a way of preparing somebody for the afterlife and preparing them to go into the afterlife. You have to have food, you have to have cloth. These are clothes. That's what these represent, is sashes and clothes that are being brought. Notice that the servants who are bringing things are much smaller than these people. And we're not certain who these people are. This could be a king, or it could be a god. It's very hard to tell the difference. My suspicion this is probably a king who was buried with this, and that this represents his transition into godhood as he passes from life into the afterlife. We find lots of votive figures. At Eshnunna, which is a little town further up north the Mesopotamian valley, we had a temple, and in the temple were buried these figures made out of limestone. We see lots of these figures. They have large, expressive eyes. Their hands are put together in this gesture of prayer or pledging. And notice that they wear these very elaborate fringed kilts. And in some cases we believe these are representations of the god themselves, but other cases they're probably representations of the individual. So you would put these into the temple and they would be buried into the foundations of the temple so that you would constantly be in the temple. These things would be your proxies. And there's all kinds of these in many different ways. All of them buried in caches in the temple. Which brings us to the royal tombs of Ur. Ur is another one of these cities, just to kind of reorient you to the map. So if we go back to the map, just to show you, Ur is right there. It's a little further south. Eshnunna is a little further north. Uruk is right here. It's just dozens of these cities. So at Ur, there was a very powerful king who lived in the Middle Bronze Age. So by this point, we've already had nearly 2,000 years of Sumerian history. It's incredible. And there were a series of royal tombs. They were excavated by C. Leonard Woolley, who was a British archaeologist. And he did this as part of a joint expedition of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. I actually studied under a professor who had a chair at that museum, and so he actually opened up the vault and let us look at a lot of this stuff. Oh, it was so cool. Oh my gosh, you won't believe it. And the tombs were just filled with incredible treasures like the one that you see here. So the tombs were quite an excavation. They were covered under just 40 feet of mud brick and sealed up. Here's some excavation photos. At the very bottom of it, he found what he called the Great Death Pit. And in this Great Death Pit, he found 74 individuals that were all carefully laid on their sides in the fetal position. And they were not just ordinary slaves. They were all high-status individuals. You could tell from their teeth and their bones they had a very good diet. So these were probably the attendants to the king and queen themselves. And so C. Leonard Woolley assumed that these people, because they were so neatly arrayed, probably went to their death willingly. He imagined that they drank poison and that they, then after they died, they were arranged. Again, if you are the king, you go on to the afterlife. It's kind of strange how Near Eastern religion is kind of bleak. If you die, you go to the underworld, and the underworld is kind of a bleak existence. And the only people who go on to a nice existence are the kings, because they are somehow divine and they go on to live in heaven with the gods. So if you were an attendant or courtier to the king, his bodyguard, is the lady-in-waiting to the queen or whoever, it was probably a much better option to die with the king and have this afterlife. And who knows, probably some of these people were scared and didn't want to die. But we suspect that the large number of them actually did this willingly, that this was a great honor, that they would be part of the king's entourage forever. So this large mound that you see here is a large mound of plaster. This is the actual tomb of the king and the queen together, and all of these other people, their war carts, these soldiers in their heavy cloaks, were all buried together. But inside was just an incredible amount of wealth. All of the women and men are decked out in jewelry. You can see that the weight of the earth has crushed the skulls, but they are just absolutely decked out in jewelry made out of gold and lapis lazuli. It's beautiful stuff. And there's also just a wealth of incredibly rich materials. This is an incense stand for burning incense in the shape of a ram. This is the so-called ram in the thicket, and it stands up onto this wooden base. This is all hammered gold and silver and lapis lazuli. This is a lyre. A lyre is an ancient kind of musical instrument, much like a harp, and you can tighten the strings up here, and then it has a sounding box here, but the sounding box is decorated with this bull's head and with this inlay. When you look at the inlay, it tells this intricate story. Here is the bull's head crafted out of gold, has this magnificent luscious beard crafted out of lapis lazuli, this semi-precious stone that had to be imported from Afghanistan many thousands of miles away. When we look at the inlay, we see a scene of human-headed bull-like figures on either side of a hero. I love how we have scenes of animals, and they're bringing trays, and the trays are themselves laid with animals. And then we have some other bizarre imagery as well. This is all located on the front of the lyre box, but I think one of the more bizarre images is this one, where we actually have a donkey with human hands. That's kind of disturbing. So we have this donkey playing the lyre, and then we have a bear tuning the lyre while a gazelle plays a sistrum, which is kind of an ancient tambourine. It's kind of funny. So we don't know what this means. This may actually reference some mythology of theirs, or it may be something completely different. And then we get to the burial of Queen Puabi. Queen Puabi was completely covered in jewelry and gems. She had a curtain of beads across her front, and this curtain was made out of carnelian and chalcedony and lapis lazuli gold beads. It was really spectacular. And then she probably had this enormous headdress, a wig, that was covered in gold bands and gold leaves and 7 flowers at the top, which probably represent 7 stars and probably means that she is taking on the identity of one of the gods. Another object found there is kind of puzzling, to say the least, because no one's exactly certain what it is. It's a strange trapezoidal box, also with very rich inlay. And this has come to be called the Standard of Ur. That is, Woolley assumed that this was something that you put up on a pole and you carried before the king as a representation of his military might. You can see in this animation how it has 2 sides and all of it is decorated. And there are the 2 sides there. So it's a strange thing. Debate rages on what this was intended to be. Some say that no, it's a sounding box for a musical instrument, but nobody knows. As far as the depiction, on one side, again, we have this hierarchy. Lower registers we show people bearing burdens and bringing animals. They're probably bringing tribute to a king or perhaps a god. And then we see higher ranking individuals. We can tell these are higher ranking individuals because they're wearing those fringed kilts and they have shaved heads. These are characters that are probably priests who are bringing animals to sacrifice. And then at the very top, we have a scene. Now, we don't know what this is, but it's obviously a scene of people seated on thrones, drinking, being attended to by servants, and we assume that these are nobles, kings, gods. It's really hard to tell. But it's important that it seems the most important guy is this guy here, because he's facing everybody else, and he's larger than everybody else. And, of course, you have the musicians playing the lyre. This is a great demonstration of the hierarchy of scale that, the musicians, no offense to any of you musicians out there, I know it's hard, they're not as important as the ruler, so they're going to be shown smaller. We can also see that they're adapting certain conventions. Remember how we talked about conventions? Notice that the face is in profile, but the eye is a forward eye. So what they're doing is they're like, well, we want you to know that this is an eye, but if we showed an eye from the side, it would look like this weird, triangle thing, and so we don't want to cause any confusion. Notice also that the shoulders are forward, the chest is forward, but the rest of the body is in profile. This is a little awkward at times, but it's a convention. Again, remember what we said about conventions, they're lies to kind of represent what they want you to see. So on the one side of this, we have a scene that seems peaceful, a scene of tribute or of offerings to the gods or to the rulers, we don't know. And then when we get to the other side, we have a war scene where we have individuals with war carts being drawn by donkeys. I know horses hadn't been domesticated yet. Donkeys are The donkeys are the most sophisticated military technology around. And we show infantry, and we have war imagery and battles. And of course, this is very important because if you are a king, you get lots of privileges as a king, but the principal duty of a king is war. That is, if things go sideways, you're there to send your troops, and you are the one that funds the troops and pays for the war carts, pays for the spears and all the weapons. And you are the person that goes out to defend the city. So these are kind of, the two sides of this box kind of represents the identity of the king, and he's probably this guy right here in the center. What his job is. So that his job is to, he receives, on this side, you can see him receiving the tribute. He receives the tribute in good times because he needs those resources to take care of his people in the bad times. And you'll see this a lot, that war imagery is about the projection of power, and it maintains the authority of the king. So you have some beautiful scenes of soldiers marching here and basically killing and murdering people and then taking away the prisoners of war captive. I love the people being trampled under the horse, not the horses, but the donkeys. And then we have the prisoners being brought to the king himself. And the king is backed up with his bodyguards. So this is a triumph scene. This is a scene of the victory of the king over his enemies. Well, they didn't always win, because there's another group called the Akkadians. And in the middle of the 3rd millennium, in the Bronze Age, a guy by the name of Sargon the Great actually marches down into Sumer and conquers it. On a brilliant stratagem, riding a giant orange arrow. I have no idea why I did that. But anyway, and so this whole area becomes unified under a single nation. Now the Sumerians, each single city was its own independent nation, and they kind of unified together for common defense and trade and religious purposes, but each one was their own separate nation, but not so with the Akkadians. The Akkadians are probably the first true nation state in the history of mankind. All of these cities were ruled by one king, who had a very centralized rule, and the Akkadians were noted for their very, very militaristic rule and their projection of power over everyone else. And they also have very sophisticated art. Now, in their case, there's no doubt they claim to be god kings. The Sumerians, they seem to be kings that are, given the right to rule by the gods. But the Akkadians are god kings. They depict themselves as gods. Here we see this wonderful early example of metal casting. So this is mostly copper. It's actually a little bit of alloy into it, but this is a copper casting, and it shows the face of a ruler. And this is one of the first examples we have of what's known as the lost wax method. This is a huge technological advance in terms of technique. So what do we mean by lost wax? Well, if you want to make a sculpture, you pretty much have one of two choices. You can take something hard, like wood or stone, and carve away the parts that you don't like till it looks like the thing you want it to look like. That's a subtractive method because you're subtracting material away. Or you can model something in clay, and you build it up out of clay and you add to it. So we call that an additive thing. So you either add up, you either carve away something hard, or you add up in something soft. Now you can take the ceramic, the clay, and fire it, and that makes it a lot harder. But ceramic is brittle, and it can break, and it's not as prestigious as stone. So what do you do if you want something that, has the subtlety? You can guess that it's a lot easier to model something up adding clay than it is to carve away. What if you want something that has the full range of expression of something that's modeled or added up, but isn't a more prestigious material? Well, they invented this method called lost wax. It's really ingenious. It's kind of hard to explain, but you start with a model. You make the model originally in clay, and then you make a mold of it. This mold then allows you to make a copy of the item in clay but out of wax. And the great thing about wax is that it's rigid, it'll hold its form, but it can melt. You then take this wax model here, and you have to be careful how you do this. It's very technical. You have to have pins to hold it in place, and you have to have sprue holes. We'll explain what those are for in a minute. But you encase this entire thing in what's called an investment. The investment is itself made out of clay or plaster. And then you put the thing in a kiln, and all the wax melts off and melts away. And what you're left with is a tiny little empty space that is exactly the same dimensions as your original clay model. And so you now have a mold. You can flip the thing upside down and heat it back up and pour copper or bronze into it. And now you see what those holes are for. These sprue holes allow the bronze to flow evenly to the entire surface, and they also allow hot gases to escape out these holes. And without allowing those hot gases to escape, investments explode, and they spatter hot metal all over, and then everybody curses you out at the foundry at BYU, and you decide that maybe you should go into a career in art history instead. Not speaking from experience, just purely hypothetical. So it's great fun. Casting metal is way fun. It's hot, it's molten, it's very exciting, it's extremely dangerous, but when you're done, you can break off all the bits you don't want, and you have something that is the exact copy of your original, except now it's in a much more prestigious material, bronze or copper, or the case may be. So you can tell that they only cast the head of this. The body was probably made out of either stucco or wood or something less valuable. And this must have been an incredible expense to make this thing. It's incredibly rich. And you can see that the artists really knew what they were doing. It's a mixture of stylization, abstraction, and naturalism. When you look at the transition of the nose to the cheek, oh, that's really beautiful, naturalistic. But obviously, I mean, the eyebrows look like upside-down Nike swoops. The beard is really stylized. The lips and the nose and features are a little too sharp. This is obviously meant to capture the likeness of whoever this is, but it's also meant to make them look very imposing, very godlike. And that brings us to the last feature of this, is the damage to it. Its eyes were actually physically gouged out, and this thing was intentionally buried. Now I want to point out that at this time, a big chunk of cast copper like this was probably worth a small fortune. And yet, its eyes were deliberately gouged out, and it was buried intentionally to get rid of it. So rather than somebody cutting up into pieces and remelting it and using it as cash, because that's how valuable it would have been, they actually buried it. And that shows you that whoever this was, they really, really hated this person. And this probably represented one of the Akkadian rulers. And the Akkadian rulers were incredibly vicious and militaristic, and they were considered tyrants, and so they were overthrown. And so likely when they were overthrown, they gouged the eyes out of this thing to disempower it and then buried it to forever curse it. It was so cursed that they didn't even remelt it to use it for the cash or the value of the metal, which had to be worth a fortune. So remember what we said about likeness and presence. It's clear that the people who damaged this thing really thought this represented the presence of the ruler, that this thing projected the power and the presence of the ruler, so they did everything in their power to disempower it by gouging out the eyes. Eyes are often seen as the windows to the soul, and so they have this expressive power. When you take a look at some of the objects left by the Akkadians, you have to marvel at their skill, but you also kind of have to marvel at their brutality. This is the Stele of Naram-Sin. This is a grandson of Sargon the Great. And first of all, let's just talk about it stylistically. Notice how, relative to the Sumerian period, we have much more naturalistic representation of the muscles. We have a sense of the form and dimension of the legs, this very beautiful high relief. So there is a great advance in terms of skill of rendering forms. But what's being rendered is really rather scary. This is a stele, and a stele is just a tall block of stone. And this one was used as a marker. This one was out on the far edges of Akkadian territory. It was actually found in Iran. And so this is like a signpost. You would come to it and it would declare, hey, you are entering into the territories of the Akkadians and Naram-Sin. Well, when I used to drive, nobody drives anymore. We all stay at home. We'll never get out. Oh my gosh. Sorry, a little bit of a breakdown there. But when I used to drive, before the days of the pandemic, and I would drive back and forth from UVU to home, I always pass a signpost that says, Provo, welcome home. Okay, well, you can look at this image and you can guess this isn't a welcome home image. It actually depicts the victory of Naram-Sin over a group of people who live in the mountains, the Lulubi. I know that sounds like a brand of yoga clothing, but it's not. The Lulubi are mountain-dwelling people, so here you have the mountain. And you can guess from this depiction that this is not a nice welcome home image. Basically, you see Naram-Sin, he's larger than everybody else. And he's very clearly a god. He is under the sun symbol. He has the horns on his helmet, which indicate that he is, a god. He has a war mace under his arm. He holds a bow in his hand. He has a spear. This poor guy has a javelin in his throat. Notice all the dead bodies he's trampling on. Notice the bodies that are thrown down. Notice this poor guy, his feet are going in this direction, but his head is in this direction because he's pleading for his life as he's fleeing away. Yeah, Naram-Sin's not a nice dude. Let's just put it that way. This is a way of saying to anyone who would come across this, the Akkadians are serious badass mofos. Do not mess with us. And so again, it's this projection of power. And images really worked to this degree. They projected power and authority in this regard. Well, not surprisingly, the Akkadians get their comeuppance. The Sumerians have had enough of them, and over a short time they revolt. But they actually learn quite a bit from the Sumerians, from the Akkadians, and they reincorporate into a single nation state with a capital at Ur. And one of the things that we'll notice is that instead of having lots of many kings united together, they have one king. And this elevates the status of local governors and administrators. And strangely enough, while we know a little bit about the kings of Ur, one of the most prominent figures we know about is this guy, Gudea of Lagash. Lagash is a city right there. And Gudea of Lagash was not a king, he was kind of a civil servant. So this is what we call Ur III, the third dynasty of Ur, or the Neo-Sumerians. The Sumerians have been conquered, so this separates the previous period from the later period. The most important person as king and ruler is going to be Ur-Nammu, who rules from the tail end of the 3rd millennium BC, and he's going to build a massive ziggurat at Ur, what we call Ur III, into the elbow, as always. But we really see a lot more from Gudea of Lagash, this character. We'll talk a little bit more about him and this expansion of a civil bureaucracy and state. We see that they also do have the same increase in technology. This is the head of an unknown ruler, and you can see this also was cast in copper. But you can see how sensitive they are to the treatment of the edges of the lips around the beard. Again, it's a mixture of stylization and naturalism. We have some abstract qualities to the beard here, but subtleties around the face and the nose show that they're increasing in naturalism. This may be Ur-Nammu himself. Ur-Nammu is the first person in human history to write down a law code and to establish the rule of law. Hammurabi does that too, but he's probably the more famous. We'll talk about him in a bit. But Ur-Nammu creates this law code and sets up this stele. And again, the stele is there to show the equivalency between the ruler and the god. Here again we have these registers, and this is very, very badly damaged, so you only have little fragments. But you can see that this is set up as a system of tiers. We even have ladders going between the tiers. And on the upper tier, we have the king himself communicating with the god. Here's another depiction of the god here. Here is the king here. He is under the symbols of Enlil and Inanna, the chief gods. And here he is being presented to the god, and the god is seated on a throne and is handing him a staff, an emblem of power, and a length of rope, and a loop. And these are indications of his authority. And you can see that the king, pours out a libation onto this sacred tree. And trees were set up to represent various deities. So this is a symbol of sacrifice. But notice that the god is larger, but he looks the king directly in the eye. So unlike the Akkadians, who depicted themselves as gods, the Sumerians go back to this standard of depicting themselves as the servants to the gods, as the high priests to the gods, who were then given authority from the gods. Ur gets completely rebuilt, and we now have a massive new city. And not surprisingly, the main temple, that is the ziggurat right here, is integrated into the palace and throne room. Again, there's no separation of church and state. All of those are put together. This ziggurat and this new city would have been absolutely amazing. Probably the largest city and the most gleaming city of its kind in the age. Not much of it, again, is left. Again, they built out of mostly mud brick. Excuse me. And it doesn't hold up terribly well. But we do have the remains of that massive ziggurat. And a ziggurat is essentially just a platform. Just like at the Temple of Anu in Uruk, it is a platform to elevate the god above the mundane plane. This one has largely been reconstructed in the lower levels. You can see it here. The upper levels haven't been reconstructed, but it does give you a sense of what this must have been like. It's quite massive. Here's a photo of what it looked like before reconstruction. And this is a pile of mud brick, but even then you can tell they added weep holes. See these little holes here? If you build something out of mud brick, even if it's in the middle of the desert and there's not much rain, you still want water to come through it to drain. So there's a lot of engineering here with buttresses and weep holes and etc. There's many different reconstructions of what this might have looked like. Here's a couple iterations. But again, the idea is that the god lives on an elevated plane, and so therefore he has to be elevated above the mundane plane. The lower levels were probably for commoners to make their offerings, and the upper levels were probably reserved for the high priests and the king himself, and the image of the god himself. One of the things that we see the most of at this time are these wonderful little statuettes of a guy named Gudea of Lagash. And Gudea of Lagash is not a king in the traditional sense. He's more of a governor of Lagash. But he was a great patron of the arts and had many of these little diorite statues. Diorite's a very, very hard stone, and it had to be imported. So that alone, the fact that this is made out of stone and comes from a stone from a faraway place, shows its wealth and its value. It shows him wearing a headdress that indicates that he is, again, not a god, but he's one of these rulers. It has these beautiful polished surfaces, these kind of open eyes, wonderful touches, sensitivity around the mouth and the lips. Again, a mixture of abstraction and naturalism, holding his hands in this gesture of kind of devotion. Some of these are really fun because even when they have the heads broken off, they have on his lap, down here below, he has a cuneiform inscription around his kilt, his little skirt, to indicate what this is about. You can see, I love how his toes have been carved. Diorite is incredibly hard, so this is really skilled. But I love that if you look very closely on this, you can see an actual recreation of a temple, and that's what this inscription is about. That this inscription is fundamentally about his restoration of a temple. And so this is really something interesting. This is the introduction of an art that's not necessarily, almost all the art that we've seen has been art of elites, and this is still art of elites, obviously, because he's an elite, he's a governor. But this also shows something of a idea of a civil community as well, something that is not purely related to religion. This is him showing his pride and revealing his pride in restoring this temple. Well, by the time we get to the second millennium BC, we really have a very complex thing going on. We have the emergence of several large powers in Syria and in the northern regions of Mesopotamia. The biggest one that you have to worry about here is Mari. Mari is this big power, and to the south we have Babylon. And Babylon eventually conquers all of lower Mesopotamia and conquers the territories that were once part of the Neo-Sumerians. And the Babylonians really have a much larger territory than anyone else up until this point, and they assimilate much of the culture and much of the belief systems of the Sumerians. The Sumerians are this very ancient civilization, so it makes sense that you would assimilate to their culture and bring these ideas in. We call them the Babylonians because they come from the city of Babylon, which is right where the Tigris and the Euphrates kind of come together. This is very close to where modern-day Baghdad is, by the way. It makes sense. You have two rivers, so you can draw on irrigation from both causes. So Babylon is famous for King Hammurabi, and King Hammurabi didn't write the first law code. That was done by Ur-Nammu, but he's really responsible for this concept of the rule of law. And the rule of law is one of these foundational beliefs of Western civilization. Not just Western civilization, Chinese civilization, Aztec civilization, this idea that you're not being ruled arbitrarily by a tyrant who can rule you at his whim. You're being ruled by somebody who has a set of rules. And the idea is that, this frees you from the cycle of revenge and retribution. I'm listening to a very excellent scholar on YouTube, Jackson Crawford. He has an Old Norse channel. He's from University of Colorado at Boulder, and he talks about law systems amongst Vikings. And it's absolutely brutal. Basically, if you snuck into somebody's house and knifed them and walked away from it, that would be considered murder. But if you just, stab somebody in the face because he insulted you, drag his body back to his home and his wife and dump it in front of him and say, he insulted me so I had to kill him, that wouldn't be regarded as murder. That would be regarded as just life. That a lot of tribal societies have this system of just indiscriminate retribution, revenge, and killing. It's really kind of ugly. Well, you can't say that about the Sumerians, the Babylonians. They made really fast rules that, you don't just kill somebody because they insult you. There actually has to be a crime. There actually has to be due process. And again, all of this is couched in the idea that this is what the gods wanted. So then Anu and Bel called by name me, Hammurabi, the exalted prince who feared God, to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land. So you can trust Hammurabi because this doesn't come from him. This comes from the gods themselves. And it sets out the rules of law. It sets out ideas of social order. It talks about, and of course there's a hierarchy. King is at the top. The temples are sacred, so you can't offend them. But it also deals with ordinary people. But, and of course, slaves are not treated like real people, and women are of lesser status than men. This is not an enlightened age. But considering what happened before, this idea that you had to have witnesses, this idea that you had to have due process, was really important, and it gave a lot of stability to life. And so this is what religion does, is it gives us this sense of order, and it's where we get things like rule of law, and rule of law continues to be a major view of Western civilizations today, this idea of due process. But he did more than just make the rule. He actually carved it on steles, on these massive blocks of stone, these upright blocks of stone, so anybody could read it. So if there was ever a dispute, you could go to the stele and say it right there, that's what this says. So this became like their constitution, so much like our Constitution and our Bill of Rights guarantee our rights. And we can actually go to the Constitution and say, see, it says so right there, etc. You could do the same thing. And what's interesting is you can see that it has the entire law code written in cuneiform on this diorite column. Again, diorite, a chunk of diorite like this had to be imported, so it was a very expensive stone. But at the top of it, we have a very interesting scene. We have Hammurabi himself. And everything about this scene is meant to indicate the equivalence between Hammurabi and the god. And the god here might be Anu, it might be Bel, it might be Shamash. It's hard to know. But everything about this guy indicates that he's the god. He is standing on a platform, and the platform has these little scalloped edges, which indicates water. So he stands on, water. The oceans, he rules over them. He sits on a throne, and the throne actually looks like the entrance to a temple. So this associates him with the temple. He has this beautiful multi-layered fringed skirt and kilt. He has a multi-horned tiara. He has a tiara with 4 tiers of bull horns, which associate him with the sun. And if that isn't enough, he has lightning or light radiating out of his shoulders to indicate that he's the god. He's also taller than Hammurabi. If he stood up, he would tower over the top of him. So he's obviously the deity. And he holds a rod and a cord around the rod, and he is handing this to Hammurabi. Hammurabi holds one hand up to his face in a gesture as if to speak. That is, he is receiving the word of God to himself and is going to speak it back out. And his other arm is draped across himself in a kind of gesture of respect and deference to this god. Now, why is he handing him a staff and a rope? Well, in the ancient world, everything was measured according to the king, literally. That is, the standard measurement of a cubit was the distance from the king's elbow to the king's wrist, or sometimes the tip of the king's longest finger. That was the distance of a cubit, about 20 inches, but that varies from king to king. And so a rod was made that would establish the standard of measurement. So the king is the standard of measurement for the entire kingdom. And there would also be ropes made that would be the standard length. So there is this metaphor here that the king's rod, you are measured up against the king's rod. But the king's rod for the standard measurement is also this measurement of the law. And so here he is, you can see it's not his law, it's not his rule, it is the god's rule, and it is being given to him. And what I love about this is that even though this guy is much, much larger here, they still look at each other in the eye to show that they are equivalent. And this is, very, very similar to Judeo-Christian beliefs. If you read the Bible, in the Bible, it says that, Moses, who was the lawgiver to Jews and then subsequently to Christians and all later peoples that follow in that tradition, that Moses was the ultimate lawgiver, but he got the law from God. And God, he looked, and it says in the scripture, it says, he looked in God face to face as a man does. The other thing is there's this wonderful line where God says to Moses, he says, Moses, you shall be a god to Aaron, and Aaron shall be his god to the people. So the idea, the implication is it doesn't matter if you get it from the king. Ultimately, it comes from the god, and you can trust it. It's this image that is supposed to show to you that you can trust the order and the rule of law because ultimately it comes from God. Well, I'm going to just talk a little bit about Mari. Mari is this kingdom that is very closely related. It's still in this cultural milieu. Mari is a kingdom that's up in the northern regions, and we have one of the best preserved palaces from this time period as well, with a series of open courtyards. Again, there's not much to look at today, again, made from mud brick, which doesn't hold up terribly well over time, but we have one of the earliest frescoes, and we have a similar investiture ceremony. In this case, it's Zimmerlin. Zimmerlin is the ruler of Mari, and we see he is in a kind of architectural framework with palm trees, which are associated with royalty, and he is surrounded by griffins. So in the center scene here, we have an investiture ceremony, and then we'll look at a detail of one of these griffins. It's very faint, but you can see it's the same thing. We have the god who has radiating light coming out of his shoulders. He stands on a platform in a dais, and he hands a staff and a rod to Zimmerland to show that he is the rightful ruler and has the authority. And they are surrounded by supernatural creatures, griffins and gods. Griffins are creatures. These griffins actually have human faces, but you can see that they have bodies of lions. You might actually call these sphinxes, and the wings of eagles to indicate they have the bodies of lions and the wings of eagles to indicate that these are not ordinary circumstances, that he is in the presence of these protectors to divinity, these supernatural characters. Well, the last culture we're going to talk about is actually located in Turkey, and that is the kingdom of the Hatti, or the Hittites. Now, just to go back to our map, just to orient ourselves. So we're talking about, most of what we've been talking about has been in this region here. Now we're going to be talking about this. This is Anatolia. This is the modern-day nation of Turkey, but it's a high, rocky plateau, and it was once the center of a vast empire. And this empire, towards the end of the Middle Bronze Age and into the Late Bronze Age, actually conquered the Old Babylonians. Now, the Babylonians will have a great comeback. The Neo-Babylonians, we'll talk about them at a later date. But they actually come way down into the northern part of the Mesopotamian Valley, and they're responsible. And they had a capital city at a place that's modernly called Bogoskoy, but it's actually called Hattusha. So they conquer Mari in the Old Babylonian Empire, and they last right up through the Late Bronze Age. So by the time we enter the 2nd millennium BC, we're out of the Middle Bronze Age and into the Late Bronze Age. They're centered in central Anatolia, this high rocky plateau. They did have written records and their own writing system, but what's really known about them is that they have just incredible ability to work in stone. So again, massive city gate. These huge monoliths, and carved on the face of the monoliths are these lions. And the lions, again, are the symbol of political authority, of power and projection. Their cities were just incredibly well defended. Again, a very militaristic society, but a very sophisticated society, with double-walled defenses. If you go to the location today, you can see the remnants of some of these walls. The stones are just massive. Here's a reconstruction where they would have been, covered over with stucco. Here you can see some of the remnants of the double walls. Here are the foundations of the double walls. And here's a reconstruction of what this might have looked like. So a really advanced civilization. And they had a lot more resources. They had, an area that had stone and trees and woods and also silver, and really incredible expert workers in silvers. This is a stag vessel, so this is a drinking horn, and you can see how wonderfully made this is. This is made out of repoussé. Repoussé is a technique where you start with a flat sheet of silver and you hammer it out into the shape. Silver and metals are very malleable, and if they're thin enough and you know your skill, you can actually hammer all these details. It's just amazing to think that all the details here are done with a set of hammers and punches. Around the rim of the cup, we have a scene of people with falcons and also, hiccups today, I don't know why. Also riding on stags. Really incredible work. One of their most important sites is Yazilikaya. Yazilikaya is a rock-cut temple. It would have had a massive building in front of it that would have limited access, but towards the back, into the elbow, they carved out a temple right out of the living rock. And you can't get access to this except by this narrow passageway. And as you come into this narrow passageway, there are figures carved into the rock. Here is a procession of individuals, and you can see that they're all, processing in this direction. And we have a procession of deities and figures. And one of the most important here is going to be this figure here. And you can see that over their head, I've highlighted it here. This is very hard to see, but they have what's known as a solar disk. And a solar disk is a disk with wings. This is a very ancient symbol that exists throughout the ancient Near East and Egypt And so here in this procession of gods, here's another image of this person with this solar disk. Here's perhaps a better view of it. You can see the solar disk with wings on it. And we will see this everywhere as a representation of the ruler. So here we have the ruler, and then above him we have this kind of solar disk representation. And we will see that everywhere we go from this time forward. But we'll talk a little bit more about what happens to the ancient Near East when we get to the Iron Age. But for now, we're going to stop. And we'll close it off there. And we'll come back. Next lectures will drop on Monday, when we'll talk about the other great Bronze Age civilization, and that's going to be Egypt. And that's always a fun one. So look forward to it, and thanks for hanging in there. Bye-bye.